before we move on from this inaugural Kraken season entirely, let's take one last big picture look back at the season that was, with 5 things that led to that 30th place finish, which is not necessarily what we were hoping for, but also not everything was bad, so we'll get 5 good things as well, and then some player awards at the end. What's cracking, everybody, and welcome to the first ever between seasons off season in Seattle Kraken history, as the Kraken don't end up making the playoffs, as we all well know by now. And like I said, this is going to be a more big picture look at the season for the Kraken, and we're going to get more into specific players down the road, so not a lot of specific player talk in this one. Now, when it comes to these 5 things that I picked that could have gone, well, to put it lightly, better for the Kraken over the course of this season, I did try to stick to things that were actually within the team's control and things on the ice. Now, off the ice, there were some big unforced issues with especially ease of watching games, which is more of a root sports problem than the Kraken themselves. And then there were a number of things that were outside the team control that definitely had a pretty big impact as well in how this season ended up going. For example, injuries were definitely something that hit the Kraken harder than most other teams. There are still teams that were hit harder, like Vegas or Montreal, for example, but the Kraken had some pretty big ones and had a number of times, at least 4 that I know of, where their leading scorer at the time went down to injury. Jared McCann had that happen twice in the season, Jordan Eberle, and as well Jaden Schwartz. And that's not even to mention Brandon Tanev, who, although he wasn't a leading scorer at the time he got hurt, did go out for the season within the first half of it, and at the time he went out was easily the fan favorite and having a pretty good season himself, as well as very clearly being a leading source of energy on that Kraken bench, which, while it won't necessarily show up in a stat sheet, made his injury and when he went out almost more obvious immediately in how the team performed than any of those previous injuries that I talked about. But again, as far as injuries are concerned, while there were more in this season for the Kraken than you'd like to see in an average one, it is just kind of part of hockey and something that every team deals with to one degree or another. The thing that had the biggest negative impact on this season, though, that was out of the team's control and was unique to this season, or at least unique in the sense that it was the first time an expansion team was dealing with anything like this, was of course COVID. Now sure, again, like injuries, every team dealt with COVID in this season and has over the last couple of years to some degree or another. And although the Kraken may not have had the largest quantity of players or even the most games missed for guys going in and out of protocol, though they still had plenty of that, it definitely, I still think, had the biggest impact on the Kraken of any team in the league. And that's because it prevented the Kraken from doing any of those player bonding exercises, or certainly the number of practices that they would have liked to do coming into the season as a brand new team and a brand new group of guys coming together for the first time, which meant that the Kraken then ended up having to do all of that team bonding and learning how to play together for that first time in the regular season itself, which, while we're talking about things that were out of the team's control, also included starting the season for 5 games on a road trip that was, well, had plenty of travel between games on top of it. All of which, on top of being an expansion team in the first place, led to what Ron Francis, who didn't want to make excuses and has now been involved in 40 seasons in the NHL, between being a player and involved in front offices across the league, called the most difficult season he's ever been a part of, which again, he doesn't say lightly. Again though, even with all of that was out of their control, there were still plenty of things within the team control that led to this season going the way it did. The first of those 5 things being the bad start defensively. Now, again, this could have something to do with that lack of having time to practice together before the season, but this was a team that we expected coming into the year to be pretty good on the defensive end. Sure, the offensive issues, which we'll get to, were somewhat expected given the roster, but on the defensive end, this was a team that we really expected to get off to a better start, and early on in the season, well, let's just say there were a number of defensive lapses, especially early in the season, that led to near constant odd man rushes on goal going back the other way. And that wasn't just the defensemen, that also had to do with the forward core, who, as far as defense is concerned, was largely built with two-way play in mind and getting guys that were good in the defensive end as well as being able to at least get the puck moving in the offensive end anyway. And as we'll get to later on in the video, the defense did rebound as the season went along, eventually turning into a pretty good season, at least statistically for them. But again, the start to the season was far from ideal, and certainly not to be expected with the personnel that the Kraken had going in. And it also, I think, at least had a pretty big impact on the second thing, and that was goaltending. Now, to be clear, I didn't put these 5 things that went wrong for the Kraken over the course of the season in any particular order, But if you ask anybody across the league who wasn't necessarily intimately familiar with the Kraken season and watching every game, they would certainly have the opinion that goaltending was the biggest thing that went wrong for the Kraken in the season. And at least statistically, it's hard to blame them for that opinion, where the Kraken finished dead last in team save percentage. Certainly a big surprise considering coming into the season, many people looked at this goaltending tandem of Grubauer and Drieger as potentially a top 5, if not certainly a top 10 tandem coming into the season. Of course, with Grubauer being a Vezina finalist the year before, and Drieger, while he hadn't necessarily had much of a starting role, had been a pretty good goaltender himself in the time he had played in Florida. Of course, the season didn't really go well for either one of them. Now, for Grubauer, I do think that there was a big impact that was had on his season by that poor defense and constant odd man rushes that he faced early on. He has self-admittedly been kind of a goaltender that, even in Colorado, took him a while to get used to the defensive system in front of him and figure out what type of chances he was going to see and knowing where he was going to expect shots from. And when the defense took a large portion of the start of the season to figure out how to play with each other, it took him even longer then to not only learn behind a defense, but learn behind a defense that was learning to play together in the first place. And since again, he was the starting goaltender for the Kraken for the majority of the season, on top of also being a Vezina finalist last year, like I mentioned, it is understandable how he ends up being the scapegoat, at least from a national media perspective, for how this season went for the Kraken. Though it's also fair to mention that Drieger, who had been good in Florida, also struggled for the Kraken, and even Decord in the games he played, while being one of the best goaltenders in the AHL, struggled pretty mightily for the Kraken as well. So while Grubauer had his issues, it certainly wasn't just Grubauer, which does kind of point to more of a larger problem for the team as a whole. Which, by the way, seems to be something that didn't go unnoticed by the team, who has moved on or decided not to renew the contract of their goaltending coach, and we'll have a new coach for the guys in net next season. Now, it is fair to mention that both Grubauer and Drieger had portions of their season that were bounced back from certainly the start of the season, with Grubauer finally having a chance to get used to a defense that finally figured out how to play together, and Drieger finally able to play consistently after a couple of injury issues, and then a bout with COVID, having a tough start to his season as far as being able to actually be on the ice. But even with that being said, and even with some pretty good defense in the back half of the season in front of them, consistency was an issue for both goaltenders throughout the back half of the season by itself, where, although they did have stretches of playing well, both of them had some pretty bad stretches as well just in those last few months. Though a lack of consistency was far from exclusive to the goaltenders, and is the third big thing that went wrong for the Kraken in my eyes over the course of this season. The team as a whole really did not play very consistently at all, and not just game to game, but period to period, as we saw at the start of the season and in the back half of the season, where at the start of the season, the Kraken frequently got off to bad starts, but frequently had very good second periods, and then started to fall apart in the third period, especially as we got on towards the middle part of the season, where those quick response goals in the third periods became a bit of an issue. And then in the final parts of the season, even though the team started to play better and started to get off to better starts in the game, the second period, especially in the last month, became a big problem where the Kraken would get out to a lead, and then blow it entirely in that second period. And probably the place that the Kraken struggled most with that lack of consistency leads us to our fourth big problem for the Kraken in this season, and that was special teams, where, I guess to be fair, the power play was pretty consistent over the course of the season. The problem was it was consistently terrible, where it ends up finishing 29th in the NHL with a 14.2% conversion rate. So yeah, pretty bad outside of one short stretch that they had over a week or two, I think in January, where they did seem to get something figured out and were able to score a few times. And then I guess at the end of the season, they were able to score a few more times when Matty Beniers showed up, though that I don't really think had a lot to do with how the power play was playing, and had more to do with the fact that Beniers was just making them look better than they actually were. And we'll get into more what went wrong with the power play specifically when we get to things that the Kraken need to improve going into next season in a future video. But again, to say the least, it was consistently a problem for the Kraken over the course of the season, and absolutely needs to improve if the Kraken want to be at all competitive in years to come. Meanwhile, the penalty kill was probably the most inconsistent thing for the Kraken over the course of this season, where over the course of the season, the penalty kill would go through these periods of time where it seemed like they could handle anything that an opposing team threw at them, even regardless of who that team was, and frequently were even able to create some shorthanded chances and score on a number of those. But then, almost like a flip being switched, they would go right into these stretches where they were almost an automatic goal against, giving teams things like games where they would go 3 for 4 on the power play, 3 for 3, 2 for 2. I mean, you get the point. They're basically just absolutely terrible. And it's those bad parts throughout the season that end up as a whole leading to the Kraken penalty kill over the course of the entire season being the 31st ranked penalty kill with a 74.6% kill rate, with only the Detroit Red Wings being worse. Though, to be fair, the Canucks were very close to being worse for the Kraken and actually were worse than the Kraken for most of the season. And funnily enough, it ends up being a Kraken game where the power play was, again, absolutely terrible that allowed the Canucks penalty kill to jump the Kraken, which again puts the Kraken now at that 31st spot. Finally, the fifth and final thing, or at least final thing that I'm going to list in this video that went wrong for the Kraken in the season, was the scoring ability of the team as a whole. And honestly, it really has more to do with the finishing power of the Kraken, where they were able to keep the puck in the offensive zone for a good amount of the time, even though coming into the season, we did kind of know that scoring was going to be an issue for this team. Honestly, I was kind of surprised by how well the Kraken were able to maintain possession of the puck, and we'll get to that here in a second. But in the end, they just were not able to finish in the offensive zone nearly enough, or nearly, again, consistently enough. In the end, getting 29th in shots on goal, as well as 29th in high danger chances, which I have to say, just from having watched the games, is not terribly surprising, considering the Kraken frequently, whenever they would get chances in the offensive zone, just went for one pass too many. Instead of going for what could have been a high danger chance, they would try to pass that puck that one more time to get an even more high danger chance, but in the end, having that pass being broken up and the puck never ending up on net in the first place. And then when the Kraken did take shots, a lot of those shots ended up coming from the outside, so it's again not terribly surprising that the high danger chances are low, even with the shots on goal also being pretty low. Not to mention the fact that when you take as many shots as the Kraken did from the outside, it gives a much better chance of those shots being deflected or blocked before they can even get to the net in the first place, which does bring those shots on goal total down. Now again, this isn't a terribly surprising problem for the Kraken to have in this inaugural season. We kind of saw it coming with the roster that they had built, plus when you are forced to build a roster off of largely third line players from other teams, most of whom are kind of pass first type of players, it's not, again, terribly surprising that you end up with a team that tries to go for that extra pass a few too many times and doesn't get enough chances off on net. Either way, it still is something that the Kraken need to fix going on into the future, and we'll get a little bit more into that in a future video down the road. Before we move on entirely, though, to things that went well for the Kraken this season, I think it is fair to mention that I didn't mention coaching as one of the big problems for the Kraken, and I know that's something that people will bring up in the comments. And honestly, while I do think coaching could have been one of these 5 things, I think it kind of just shows up more in some of the problems that the Kraken did have that I brought up. Again, scoring, it's certainly a problem here where the Kraken did take way too many of their chances from the outside, and that could have something to do with offensive scheme, where the Kraken seemed to be looking for just taking those shots from the outside and hopefully getting guys to the net to either deflect or get second chances into the net, and that didn't really happen. So they end up taking shots from the outside and then having nobody in front of the net to follow up on those chances. Meanwhile, on the penalty kill and power play, again, yes, when both your special teams units struggle as much as the Kraken did, that does have something to do with coaching, and it can't be ignored as part of the problem, especially on the power play, where it seemed like they were just way too content with passing around the outside and not trying to get some actual hard to predict plays off. Meanwhile, with the penalty kill, when they were going well, they seemed to be aggressive and checking the opposing players, not allowing them to just freely pass it around. Meanwhile, when they're playing poorly, they just kind of turtled into a shell and hoped that the shots weren't good ones. And when it comes to those more player positioning or ways they move the puck around on the power play type of things, that does have something to do with scheming and the coaching that gets them there. But moving on now to the things that I thought went well for the Kraken over the course of the season, because there were some of those even in spite of how the season finished for them. The first 2 things I'm actually going to lump together because one kind of leads to the other. The first thing being forechecking, where the Kraken were fantastic on the forecheck for the vast majority of the season. Sure, some of that aggressive forechecking that the Kraken had, especially early on in the season, did kind of lead to some breakdowns going back the other way, but it was something that the Kraken, I thought, really stuck to over the course of the season, and one of the best things that the coaching did do was enforce that forechecking mentality and forechecking identity of this team that allowed them to get that fantastic possession time that they had, ending with the 13th place in Team Corsi for percentage, which is something that you'd like to see them continue on into the future. Now, as we just mentioned, even with them having that much possession and even again to the eye test, outplaying teams when it came to just spending time in the offensive zone, that time in the offensive zone didn't necessarily lead to the number of shots on goal or high danger chances that we'd like to see, but it's a good starting place. And as long as they can continue that time in the offensive zone, that good forechecking and that good possession time, this is a team that if they can add the scoring onto that or the finishing ability, they can be competitive going into the future. And of course, I couldn't talk about forechecking and a forechecking identity of the team without mentioning that as we look towards the next season, the return of Brandon Tanev certainly will be a big addition to that and a big help for this team going on to the future, trying to maintain that personality. Meanwhile, at the other end of the ice, the third thing that I thought went really well for the Kraken, although again, as we mentioned, it didn't go particularly well at the beginning of the season, was, like we mentioned, the defense and specifically the shots on goal allowed. Now, for the Kraken, again, the start of the season did not go particularly well when it came to defense, but especially in the back half, they at the very least limited teams from just teeing off on the Kraken net. Although there were some teams that were able to get shot attempts off, Seattle did a very good job of limiting, in a lot of cases, those shot attempts to the outside, which allowed them to either deflect or block those shots before they ever got to the net. In the end, finishing the season 4th best in the NHL in shots on goal against, which, by the way, while we're on the topic, only 2 of the top 11 teams in that category didn't end up making the playoffs, those being the Kraken, and of all teams, the other recent expansion in the Vegas Golden Knights, who finished 8th in that category. And it wasn't just the quantity of shots on goal that the Kraken were good at limiting, it was also the high danger shots on goal that the Kraken did a good job of limiting as well, where they ended up finishing 9th in the league there. Though, to be fair, there are some problems I have with the high danger shots on goal stat, where although the Kraken did a pretty good job of not allowing too many high danger shots on goal, the quality of a high danger shot does vary quite a bit, which we do see play out as far as stats people are concerned in the expected goals against, where the Kraken did finish more towards the bottom of the league. And that does explain a little bit more of the struggles in net for the Kraken, where when a high danger chance did come, it was frequently a odd man rush or just a breakaway for the other team, which is a much more likely to score event than just a shot from the slot or off to the side of the net. But still, if the Kraken can play the vast majority of next season the way that they played the back half of this season defensively, limiting those shots on goal and high danger chances, then that should help the goaltending have a bounce back season next year and maybe help this team actually have a chance to compete for the playoffs. I know that might seem like a bit of a pipe dream considering how this season went, but I think the possibility is there. Now, I did say at the beginning of this video that this was going to be more of an overview type of review of the season, and not necessarily talking too much about any one player specifically. We'll do that a little bit more when we get to player grades in a future video. That having been said, the last 2 things do have to do more with a couple of specific players. The first one being Jared McCann, where I have to say, while having just one player finish the season at 50 points is maybe not ideal, McCann's season certainly was a highlight for the Kraken, as he is the only player who does end up finishing with exactly 50 points in his case. And while again, you'd like to have more players above that total, it wasn't necessarily something that we expected that he would be leading the team in points. Sure, he was one of the candidates for the Kraken coming into the season as a potential breakout player, giving a more expanded role than what he'd seen before. But again, leading the team that had guys like Yanni Gourde and Jordan Eberle, who were to some extent proven scorers elsewhere. Great season for McCann and definitely bodes well going into the future, especially with that new contract that he does end up signing halfway through the season. Not to mention the fact that in that struggling power play unit that we've already talked about, McCann was pretty much the lone bright spot as he led the team in power play goals with 8, twice as much as any other player, and was tied for the lead in power play assists with 9, with Vince Dunn also having 9 on the season. And of course, with this 5th and final thing that went well for the Kraken in this inaugural season, since you already know it's somewhat player specific, you probably have a pretty good idea of who it's about. It has to be Matty Beniers playing the final 10 games of the season for the Kraken and coming away with 9 points in those first 10 NHL games, coming immediately up from the college ranks at the age of 19. Again, a fantastic start for him. and I don't think there's a single Kraken fan who can't wait to see what he can do with a full season next year. One honorable mention I just thought of as far as things that went well for the Kraken in the season that honestly I probably should have had as one of the 5 things in the first place, but that would be the trade deadline for the Kraken, where although I have to say I do think that Ron Francis and the Kraken as a whole missed an opportunity with picking up some draft picks and whatever else they could have gotten via trade at the expansion draft, they made up for a large chunk of that, if not all of it, at the trade deadline, where they made some pretty good moves and picked up a huge haul of picks going on into the future, which some of those will likely turn into players, maybe even like a, I don't know, Kevin Fiala type from the Wild, who is an RFA, but the Wild probably will end up moving via trade with the cap issues they have going on to next season. If you have anything you'd like to add to either the things that didn't go well or things that did go well down in the comment section, please feel free to do so. I'd love to see what you guys think down there about things that, again, went poorly or well for the Kraken. Before we call it an end to this video, though, I thought it would be fun to do some end of the season player awards for the Kraken. I mean, yeah, the season didn't go great for them, but I thought it would be a fun thing to do. Anyway, again, feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments section on any of these awards. For this Kraken inaugural season, we'll start out with the Hart Award, where I think that the MVP for the Kraken, the media got right with voting Jared McCann as the MVP. I think an argument could be made for Yanni Gourde as well, but McCann leading the team in points as well as a career high in not just points, but also goals. And we already talked about his contributions on the power play, which struggled outside of McCann. So yeah, I think it's an MVP for McCann, even with Gourde maybe being a second place somewhere behind him. The Kraken Norris Trophy for Best Defenseman, for me, goes to Vince Dunn. Now, I did kind of switch back and forth on this one. For a while, I considered Mark Giordano, even though he left at the trade deadline. He didn't have a great start to the season, but was certainly playing better for the Kraken in the back half up until he gets traded to Toronto. I also thought about Carson Soucy, considering how much of a scoring impact he had on the team. Certainly with 10 goals leading all defensemen, he had a pretty good year there. But in the end, I think Vince Dunn had the best two-way game. He certainly struggled a little bit in the first half of the season defensively, letting a number of chances get past him. But he cleaned that up in the back half of the season and also had the leading scoring defenseman for the Kraken with 28 assists on top of 7 goals. With the Kraken Vezina, there's not that many guys to choose from, obviously, since only 3 guys played in net for the Kraken, none of whom really had fantastic seasons. But I gotta give it to Chris Driedger, who I thought did have the better season between him and Grubauer, even though Grubauer played significantly more and had to kind of deal with that start of the season issues that the Kraken had defensively and just in general in front of him, with Driedger having some injury issues and then a bout with COVID to start out that first half. And to be honest, it's kind of a similar story with the Kraken Calder Award, where there's not that many guys that were eligible for it in the first place, with even some of the younger guys like Geekie having already played too many games in previous seasons to be technically eligible for it. So in the end, while I do think you could almost make an argument for Beniers in having played just 10 games, I still end up going with Will Borgen for this one. I thought he had a pretty good season for the Kraken as a whole. Kind of didn't really get in enough games early on in the season in spite of playing pretty well. He was part of that rotation early on with Lauzon, even Soucy, who probably should have been playing more on top of that, as well as Hayden Fleury, who had a bit of a frustrating season himself. Still, in the end, I'm going to pick Will Borgen of the few guys that were eligible. Meanwhile, for the Kraken Selke Award, the award for the best defensive forward, I don't think there's much question at all about who should win this one. It has to be Yanni Gourde. Certainly the best checking player that the Kraken had all season long, maybe aside from the start that Tanev had for checking at the beginning of the season, but certainly in the defensive zone, I think it was far and away Gourde that played the best for the Kraken. A guy that, based on how he plays the game, certainly won over the fans, in the end winning that fan favorite award as handed out by the team at the end of the season. And I think that's a large part to do with how he played at both ends of the ice and the energy he showed from the start of the season all the way through to the end, even with the Kraken being knocked out of the playoffs fairly early on and him coming from a team that just won back-to-back cups. Of course, there also isn't much choice to be made when it comes to the Kraken Rocket Richard and Art Ross, the most goals and most points by a player, considering those are just counting numbers. Both of those obviously again go to Jared McCann, leading the team with 27 goals and 50 points. The Kraken Lady Byng Award, the award that goes to the player that shows the most sportsmanship or the most gentlemanly player over the course of the season, I would give to Riley Sheahan, who had just 2 minutes in the penalty box over the course of the entire season in 69 games that he plays. But since we're just having some fun here and it is an award for playing a gentlemanly game, it's got to go to the German gentleman in Philipp Grubauer. especially considering he didn't just go on a Jordan Binnington type rampage in the locker room, the way the Kraken left him out to dry in net, especially early on in the season. Which isn't to say Binnington goes crazy on his own teammates, that's more opposing teams, but you get what I mean. And then with these final 3 awards, these are all ones that I just made up on the spot, decided to have a little bit of fun with. And I was trying to think of some other ones, so if you have some awards that maybe you'd like to see the NHL hand out or hand out in the future to Kraken players, please let me know about those in the comment section as well. But we'll start with the Glass Case of Emotion Award, or the Ron Burgundy Award, whichever you want to go with, for the player that spent the most time in the penalty box for the Kraken. And it might not come as a terrible surprise, even though he did leave at the trade deadline, that in spite of leaving the team early, it's still Jeremy Lauzon that ends up with this one, with 67 minutes in the penalty box. The second of these made-up awards is what I'm calling the To the Moon Award, for the player that added the most value to the team over what they were already getting paid, or the player that you could say increased their stock or team value the most over the course of the season. And this one, while there were a number of players that got more opportunity this season and played well above their contract, actually not as many as you might think, but still a number of them, the one that added the most value to this team over what he was being paid, to me, was pretty clearly Ryan Donato. Now, when it comes to consistency, like we were talking about earlier, Donato was far from the most consistent player on the Kraken roster, certainly in the defensive end to say the least. But the one thing he was pretty consistent at least in my eyes, was being one of the few players on the Kraken roster that was willing to shoot first and pass second, which, well, passing first is a perfectly good thing for a number of the players on your team to do. You want to have a few more than 1, maybe 2 guys that are shoot first, pass second, which is something the Kraken will probably have to look to fix on the roster going into next season. But at least for this season, and for Donato in particular, he does finish this season while being paid near the minimum with just $750,000 on his contract, with a career high in goals and points with 16 goals and 31 points, and tied for a career high in assists with 15. And finally, we have the Woody Award for the most snake-bitten player on the Kraken over the course of the season. That, of course, being Woody from Toy Story with the whole "I got a snake in my boot" line. Maybe there's a better name for it, you can let me know down in the comment section, but for now, we'll go with the Woody Award. And for me, the most snake-bitten player still has to be Jonas Donskoi. Of course, with Donskoi, in spite of a number of scoring chances early in the season, not getting that first goal until I think it was early February. And while late in the season, he did kind of stop shooting and wasn't quite as relevant, I would say, in the Kraken roster, even being a healthy scratch off of that fourth line a number of times in the back half. Still, that start to the season, I would imagine, probably got to him a bit. In the end, just finishing with 2 goals on the season, easily a career worst for him. And I think we can easily look for a bounce back season next year. Certainly more than 2 goals should be pretty easy to expect. Of course, a couple of other finalists for that award could be guys like Morgan Geekie, who I would say probably would finish second there. Even Jordan Eberle, although he finishes with 21 goals, he went through a couple of periods of certainly being very snake-bitten and having goal after goal taken away or stolen by goaltenders. And then at the back half of the season, especially after the trade deadline, Cole Lind, I thought, had a very good finish to the season and could have easily ended up with more goals than he did, putting a number off the post. Either way, I still think Donskoi as a season as a whole probably is the most snake-bitten player that the Kraken had in this season. Again, feel free to let me know down in the comment section if there's any other awards you'd like to see added for next year, who you thought should maybe win some of these awards rather than who I picked, and just your thoughts on this season as a whole. If you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below that help support the channel, so I'd appreciate you using them. And until next time, as we continue to look at this season and look forward to next year, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and go Kraken.